Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us to discuss economic development and state building. I am Raymond Gilpin. I'm Associate Vice President for the Center for Sustainable Economies at the United States Institute of Peace. Since we opened our doors 25 years ago, the Institute has won recognition, not just in the US, but worldwide, for even-handed and non-partisan assessments and recommendations across the conflict spectrum. Today, the Institute actively promotes peace and mediates conflict in various countries across the globe, and it leads efforts to professionalize the field. This afternoon's discussion reflects the breadth of the Institute's work and is very much in our tradition of excellence, objectivity, and the analysis of appropriate solutions. You'll all agree with me that the fragility of governance systems in a growing number of countries across the world highlights the timeliness and importance of effective and lasting state-building initiatives. Although definitions may differ as to what state-building is and what it is not, there is some consensus that successful efforts in this area must be predicated upon a judicious balance of the 3 Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development. While much is known about the first two, relatively little is known about economic development, design, and implementation in the context of state building. Recent experience in East Timor, Liberia, and Iraq suggests that we still have a lot to learn. However, looming state collapse in places like North Korea and Zimbabwe and progressive weakness in many other areas demand that lessons must be learned quickly and that the recommendations should be incorporated into effective, adaptable, and coordinated strategies very quickly. Well, learning and applying the lessons, that's only one of the many challenges facing the global community in this regard. Securing, allocating, and disbursing adequate resources for economic development programs are another important challenge, and particularly against the backdrop of the ongoing global financial turmoil and the recent downward revisions in growth forecasts for the years to come. You will agree with me that the challenges are as daunting as the need is great. And it will take more than a village to underpin state-building efforts through economic progress. And I believe that it will require a more concerted global effort and unwavering leadership. The United States, as the administrator mentioned this morning, leads in the provision of global development and humanitarian assistance, accounting for 1/5 and 1/3 respectively, according to data compiled by the OECD. I believe that we are in a unique position to exercise effective operational and thought leadership in the months and years ahead. Business as usual is not a viable option. This is why we are honored to host such a distinguished and accomplished panel. They will help us think through creative ways that the incoming Obama administration could be more effective in the provision of economic assistance in fragile environments. We, speaking on behalf of the panel, believe that interaction with you is very important, and therefore the panelists have agreed to limit their remarks to 5 to 6 minutes to allow ample time for interaction with you, the audience. You have detailed bios of all the speakers in your folders, so in the interest of time, I will introduce them very briefly and in the order in which they will make their remarks. But before doing so, I have a couple of brief announcements. First, I would ask you to join me in what I affectionately call the silencing of the cell phones routine. The principle is very, very simple. If it buzzes, beeps, rings, or sings, please turn it off as a courtesy to others and also because it affects our PA system. Second, you all have cards on your seats, and these cards are for your questions. Please use them to write your questions for the panel, and I'll pose as many as I can to the panel during the Q&A session. Our staff will be on hand to collect them when the panelists have finished making their remarks. That having been said, it gives me great honor and pride to introduce our panelists. The first to speak will be Ms. Henrietta Fore, Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development. She is responsible for managing U.S. foreign assistance and oversees programs that help reduce poverty, promote good governance, and foster sustainable economic growth across the globe. She will be followed by Dr. Stephen Radlett, Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development, where he works on issues related to foreign aid, poverty reduction, and trade between rich and poor countries. He's also co-chair of the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network. Providing a private sector dimension would be Dr. John Sullivan, Executive Director of the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is an affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He has pioneered the development of innovative approaches that link state building to wide-ranging market reforms. Our fourth speaker will be Ambassador David Litt, Director of the Center for Stabilization and Economic Reconstruction, where he leads work on research and capacity building in areas relevant to the 3 Ds. His stellar career in the Foreign Service makes him particularly suited for this environment. It now gives me pleasure to yield the podium to our first speaker, Ms. Henrietta Fore.
Thank you very much, Raymond, and it is a pleasure to see all of you. I see a great number of friends and colleagues in the audience, and so Happy New Year, everyone. Good to see you and thinking about development and economic growth and state building. I'll begin with just a few thoughts, and then I believe as a panel, we want to encourage your interaction because this is an exciting time in the world of development, and we are all thinking together about ways to do it well. So as we are thinking of passing the baton, it gives us many, many chances and opportunities for doing things even better. This topic is certainly important, as Raymond was saying, in light of the economic crisis, because it is having its effect around the globe, and it takes on a greater urgency. So let me begin with a thought that comes from Paul Collier. He estimated that the cost of a single war in a low-income country is about $64 billion US. And then when you add into this that when they looked at the average time for a conflict in Africa, the average conflict lasted 7 years. The time it takes for a country to go from its pre-war economic statistics and standard of living to its post-war coming back to that is 17 years. Therefore, my first message is that it is very important to prevent conflict, because bringing a country back, if it takes 17 years to bring a country back after a conflict, it means you have lost a generation. And often it means that the young men and the young women are not going to school, among many, many other repercussions. Conflict and fragility are an enormous impediment to development. As we look at the link between economic development and state building, we should pay particular attention to this issue of how to prevent states from falling into fragility and how quickly we can pull them out in a post-conflict situation. While economic growth is not the sole solution to putting a country on the road to recovery, it is a significant part of the solution and an area that needs addressing first. In the face of the global economic crisis, it is urgent that we get this economic attention addressed right from the beginning. Although many are suffering, it is likely that the economic downturn will hit the poor the hardest and create new challenges. We know globally, for example, that 1 billion youth will be entering the labor market in the next 5 years. Only an estimated 300 million jobs will be in the markets in the next 5 years. So they will not have the training and the access to jobs and to employment and livelihoods. For those youth and millions of others who have emerged from the grip of poverty, only to find themselves now in danger of sliding back, means that economic growth matters around the world. USAID has recently developed some guidelines for advancing economic growth broadly, and specifically in post-conflict situations. So let me give you the guidelines that we have. The first is start early. Programs that stimulate economic growth should be implemented from the very beginning of the rebuilding process, not after the humanitarian interventions or political reform, as we often have traditionally done this. Second, address the causes of conflict. Post-conflict economic growth programs must be based on understanding the nature of the conflict, the nature of the peace, and the country's level of development. When I've recently been in Gulu in Uganda and in Goma in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, both of these exhibit these characteristics. Third, set clear goals and prioritize. Clear goals are critical. In the post-conflict period, everything seems to be needed to be done at once. But there are many competing priorities. Economic growth programs should aim to reestablish essential economic governance programs, should try to restore the government's legitimacy, should boost employment, and should address the root economic causes of the conflict and stabilize the economy. Southern Sudan, anti-corruption, the roads, the agriculture that we've just recently been talking about this past week exhibit these characteristics. Fourth, host country ownership. Programs should seek full host country ownership of reforms and coordination among other donors. Host country ownership is vital in unstable and in fragile environments. This is why we tried a new model this past year in which all the development ministers from bilateral donors as well as multilaterals visited 2 countries, Afghanistan, to try to support their new national development strategy, and then Liberia. And it was with the idea that we could all think together on what the development priorities were and how we could support the host country governments. And I think that's a good new model for us. Fifth, understand recurring trade-offs, short-term versus long-term solutions, working outside of the government quickly versus going through the government. There are a few examples of some of these principles that we have, that we've been working on this past year. In Iraq in November, USAID supported the Erbil Agro-Food Expo. It drew 80,000 visitors. In Sudan, USAID introduced the first multi-branch financial institution in post-conflict southern Sudan and provides training and grants to fledgling small enterprises. Third, in the Republic of Georgia, we're supporting agricultural production, vocational education, and community development with the goal of both stabilizing and restoring the Georgian economy. To be effective as possible in implementing all of these pieces of development, we have to take a new approach to how we do things. And so I will leave you with 3 thoughts on that. The first is coordination, essential in all of these areas. The second is public-private partnerships, and I mean that broadly. Private enterprises, as well as non-governmental organizations, foundations, institutions, academic, host country governments, bilateral, multilateral donors. This is the mix that we have, a very complicated but interwoven mix. And third, use the internet, use technology to get many of these solutions and best practices out. Our ways of communicating with each other can often be too slow, and we need to go real time. With that, I'll close my remarks, and thank you, Raymond.
Good afternoon. Welcome to everybody. Thanks for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here and see such a great crowd. I was floored by the size of the crowd outside. It's really a great event and a testament to USIP. We live in exciting times and challenging times, as you all know, and that's true for a lot of things, but it's true for those of us that work in development as well. It's an exciting time in the sense that there's a growing consensus among many people in the United States of the importance of smart U.S. engagement with developing countries around the world, and that has not always been the case. But that's a growing view not only of policy elites, of senior people in political parties, but I think among a growing number of people at the grassroots level, where latest kinds of polling suggest a growing interest and acknowledgement of the importance of our engagement with poor countries. But at the same time, we live in challenging times because while people recognize the importance of smart U.S. engagement around the world, I think there's a widespread view that our tools are not up to the challenge. That's not to say that we don't do a lot of very good things and that we don't have a lot of very successful programs. We do. But they're not nearly as effective as they can be in achieving our own foreign policy goals and in supporting the goals of our partners around the world. And I think that's fairly well agreed upon by most people. I don't just mean foreign assistance here, because that's certainly not the only tool through which the United States can engage in countries, but that's our topic for discussion today. There are many other tools, our migration policies, our financial policies, our trade policies in particular, but we're going to focus our remarks on foreign assistance. There are a lot of problems with our foreign assistance programs, despite the great people who work there and despite the many successes. There are far too many objectives. If you look in the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, there are over 60 objectives and counting, and maybe more, depending on how you count them. We have too many conflicting goals. I don't know exactly what the right number is, but 60 goals is way too many for any organization or any institution. We have an organizational mess, actually. There's 21 U.S. executive branch agencies that provide foreign assistance in one form or another. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and as Administrator Ford mentioned, there's not always the kind of coordination that we'd like to see. That dispersion has gotten worse in the last few years with the introduction of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the PEPFAR programs, and the large number of programs now implemented by the Department of Defense. The legislation is outdated. Not only does it have too many objectives, but it's earmarked heavily, and it really significantly constrains the ability for us to do what's important on the ground. So there's a legislative problem. And we don't always allocate our financial and professional resources as well as we can. So there's a lot of issues out there. In my role as co-chair of the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, we've come up with a 4-point agenda for the new administration to try to address these concerns. And the 4 points are strategy, legislation, organization, and resources. First, we need a strategy that would run in parallel with the national security strategy that would delineate what our goals are in developing countries, to have a small number of achievable goals, and to say how we're going to achieve those goals, what our modes of operation are, and to open up different kinds of modes of operations to say what it is that we're trying to achieve. That's number one. Number two, legislative reform. It's time to rewrite the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. I know that's been tried many times. I have no illusions as to how difficult that would be, but we've got Howard Berman out in front of this, many other members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate, on both sides of the aisles, that are willing to roll up their sleeves and rewrite the Foreign Assistance Act to update it to this generation, since it was written right at the beginning, actually, of the Cold War. Third is organizational reform. We really do need some consolidation across agencies. There's several ways to do that. We've come out in favor of, over the long term, moving towards a cabinet-level agency, the way that the British did. I realize that's no easy lift either, and we certainly don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But what we have in mind is a model like the Environmental Protection Agency, which over a 2-decade period consolidated programs across the U.S. government and became a professional cabinet-level agency that could achieve the administration's goals between 1970 and the early 70s when it was formed, mid-70s, to 1992 when it finally became a full cabinet agency. And fourth is resources. We live in a time of constrained resources, but we underinvest in development objectives, and just in terms of trying to achieve our own goals of a more secure and safer and more prosperous world. We're going to have to do better at allocating the scarce resources that we have, but I think with the reform measures that we have in mind, we can also give Congress and the American public greater confidence that we're using every dollar more effectively, and hopefully that will lay the foundation for more resources over time once the financial crisis begins to pass. This sounds like kind of an inside the Beltway agenda, but it is not. This is crucial for making our development programs more effective on the ground. Any of you that have worked on the ground know that we are completely hamstrung because of the earmarks that we get from Congress. We cannot respond to the greatest needs on the ground. We don't have the flexibility, and we've got different agencies doing different things that don't make any sense. So this is not geared at just moving organizational boxes on a chart. This is for making things more effective on the ground. What does this mean in terms of dealing with fragile states, post-conflict situations? I think about this all the time. I spend about half my time I have the privilege of serving as an economic advisor to President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia, and I spent a lot of my time working directly in a post-conflict state. It's a difficult situation, and post-conflict, I think, provides some of the greatest challenges in development. But I think these kinds of reforms can lead us to better address some of the key problems. I think some of the key problems in post-conflict situations are among the following. Let me just quickly list four. One, which Administrator Ford also already mentioned, how to choose priorities. Everything is a high priority in a post-conflict situation. A place like Liberia, 14 years of civil war, GDP per capita fell 90%. Think about that for a minute, 90%. I cannot find any other country ever in recorded history, where, or at least in the last century, where GDP per capita fell 90%. What that means is everything has been destroyed. Infrastructure, schools, clinics, professional capacity, people, everything. So how do you choose priorities? We can't respond to the highest priorities on the ground because most of what we do is dictated by the earmarks in Washington. And so this issue of how a country itself in a post-conflict situation sets its priorities, we, the United States government, cannot always go in and help. And we see this with all the donors right now. All the donors right now love to support health. And believe me, I'm a great supporter of health programs as core to development. But from the Liberian perspective, when every donor says, well, we can't help you with your water systems or your roads or your power, but we'd love to support the health sector, it's a little bit of a problem. And the United States is guilty of that. Other donors are as well. So setting priorities is particularly difficult. We have, as a second problem in post-conflict, poor coordination across agencies. We have the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance in USAID, which does a great job, but it has to coordinate itself with the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration and State. And sometimes they fight. There's turf battles. It doesn't make any sense to have two organizations doing overlapping kinds of things. So we have that kind of problem. We also have a big problem in coordinating our humanitarian relief with longer-term development assistance. There's a bridge in the immediate post-conflict situation. Your humanitarian teams need to go in. OFDA does a great job running in, but you need to coordinate that at some point with bridging it to long-term development assistance, and we don't do a very good job about that at all. One team leaves, another team comes in, and they don't know what's going on. So coordination is the second big problem in post-conflict. The third problem is this bridge between humanitarian and development. And then the fourth I'll just mention briefly is building human capacity. There's a problem. You always want to solve today's problem and solve it immediately in a post-conflict situation. And it's important to do that, to show immediate results. But you've also got to build long-term capacity, and human capacity is at the core. And we don't do a very good job at that. We don't have the patience to do it. We don't have very good markers of how we know that we're building capacity and how we can sell it to Congress, frankly, and the American public. It's not like putting people on antiretrovirals, which everybody's for. Building capacity, professional capacity, is hard to measure, and it's hard to do. It requires training and education programs. It requires supporting a different pay scale in developing countries. It's ludicrous to think that that a developing country can bring in cabinet ministers and pay them $100 a month. It's crazy. You're going to get either incompetent people or corrupt people, and usually you get both. We need to support systems in developing countries where we pay people a decent salary. If we're going to bring in world-class talent, they got to get paid for it, and we need to help them think about how to do that. And we need patience, because building that capacity takes a long time. We have the opportunity now to modernize and strengthen our foreign assistance to engage in a much smarter way in developing countries. It's going to take vision. It's going to take time and energy, and ultimately it's going to take resources. But I think we've got the best chance to do it in a long time, and I hope the new administration goes forward in this way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And let me start by thanking Ray and the U.S. Institute for Peace for putting together this program. It was absolutely terrific, and I'm sure the rest of it will be as well. Since time is very brief, let me just start by saying that President Zellick gave the first 20 minutes of my presentation, so just everything he said, you got to do it, don't forget it, write it down, get the video, we're going to go home and do all of this. So the question is, how do you get economic growth and state building going in post-conflict societies? Let me just start with a reference to Nobel laureate Douglas North. He captured in one sentence the dilemma in front of us. How do you go from personal exchange to the ability to do contracts with strangers? What do you need to do to get from here to here? And that's what you got to do to get from Afghanistan to success, from Haiti to Florida, from Iraq to hopefully Egypt, and then further on. You got to put those things in place, or you won't get a private sector there to do it. Let me just refer to 3 myths of development as a way of showing some of the pieces that have to be thought about in doing that, in building that link, that bridge from doing business with friends and family or in cash to being able to do long-term contracting and investing. The 3 myths are, first, if there's private enterprise, then you got to have a market economy. That must be the same thing, right? Wrong. Look, and we could talk about any number of countries, any number of examples, but it was the Filipinos that invented the term crony capitalism. It was Indonesia where the family business became the state. Those stand in the way of building a market economy. Crony capitalism is not market economics. Second myth, business is a monolith. We talk about let's get the private sector engaged. Can't talk about the private sector as a whole. It's too complex and too big. People want to think that multinational corporations are going to come rushing in and invest. They're not. That doesn't mean they won't have a role. International supply chains are becoming more and more important. So being able to integrate that Iraqi firm, that Afghan firm, that Haitian supplier into, or in the case of the Haitians, back into global supply networks is really a key first step, but you've got to solve Doug North's problem. Third, markets will emerge if the government just gets out of the way. How many times have we heard that? Okay, I'm from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which automatically makes me conservative economically, of course. But, the big but, everything Zelig said, you're not going to get a market or market institutions if you think that they're going to emerge automatically. You've got to simultaneously do what Administrator Fore said. You've got to build the governance institutions at the same time that you're building the market institutions, at the same time that you're engaging the private sector. Otherwise, it just isn't going to happen. So what are those market institutions? Well, Zelig alluded to a couple of them. One, private property. Key, absolutely key. A lot of people think that's ideology. Well, get over it. It isn't ideology. Business people aren't going to come and invest, whether they're local business people or whether they're regional or flight capital that's returning or multinationals, unless they're safe, secure, welcome, and profitable. And you don't get those things unless you get property rights. Second, transparency. Everybody's got to have the same information. If you've got to do business with Suharto's cousin in order to know what the contract is, you don't have a market economy. Accountability goes without saying. Another thing which is key is competition. And there's a lot of different aspects of that, but it goes back to that issue of transparency. It goes back to having a society where the individual can form a firm, is not locked into Hernando de Soto's informal sector or underground economy, but can participate in an above-board way. So how do you get all of that? Well, one key part of it, and I'm really rushing here, one key part of it is the rule of law, which President Zelig talked about. Now, we saw the chart today, for those of you that were in the morning session where the U.S. Institute for Peace presented their big circles, which were originally tunnels. I'm really glad they're circles instead of tunnels because we've got too much tunnel thinking going on anyway, so circles are much better. Everything that was in that part that talked about economics and everything that talked about in that circle that talked about law, you got to bring those two circles together. They can't be that far apart. Private sector won't emerge in a developing country in a fragile state unless you've got some kind of functioning contracting protection. You can get spot markets, you can get bazaars, you can get, people tell me over and over and over, you know, the Chinese, what could you possibly be doing in China? They're the most entrepreneurial people in the world. True, they, in 1990, were very good at making things and selling them. They weren't very good at creating large-scale enterprises or engaging in contracts. They spent 20 years deliberately building the ability to do that. If we don't build that ability in Afghanistan, if we don't build it in Iraq, it isn't going to happen. Look at the difference between how easy it is to do business in the Kurdish region versus how easy it is to do business everywhere else. A key part of that is some kind of predictability in the policy environment and particularly in the contracting environment. I alluded to already what Henrietta Fore said about building democracy at the same time. Building democracy, though, goes straight to the issue of governance. It is not just elections. Okay, there I've said it. It's the formula. We all say it, and then we proceed to talk about elections. And we proceed to talk about civil society, and we proceed to talk about everything else. Fair enough, those are all vital. But the governance, the day-to-day decision-making, democracy has two dimensions: leadership selection, which is elections and accountability and all the rest of it, but the other selection, the other part of it is decision-making. If you do not engage your local, domestic, private sector, the Afghan entrepreneurs, one of whom is standing in the back of the room, my good friend Ajmal Ghani, if he's not engaged in his organization, the Afghan Chamber, the Afghan American Chamber isn't engaged in making those decisions and advising the government, giving feedback, creating accountability so that we know what Ajmal needs in order to solve his problem of being able to put more money on the ground and hiring a few more people, you don't get democratic governance. What you get is hopefully some wise person doing the right thing. But remember, Erasmus of Rotterdam was the last person that knew everything, and he died, I think, in about 1450. So how do you do this? Well, there's a lot of different ways of doing it, and one is something we call the National Business Agenda. That is, you just bring together and mobilize in a collective action framework business people through associations, and I mean voluntary free associations, not government-run or government-mandated associations. Ask them what to do. Put them together with some people that have some economics training so that you get market-oriented solutions. Figure out what are going to be the first steps that are going to energize and mobilize that domestic, private, entrepreneurial community, and that are going to solve the problem of Doug North's ability to go from cash, spot transactions, to long-term contracting. We've done this in the Kurdish region. You can go, this is our advertisement, go to www.sipe.org, our Iraq page, and you'll find the Kurdish Regional Business Agenda. Or you can look at business agendas that have been put together in a variety of other countries, the Philippines, Peru, and so on. Last point I'll leave you with, and then I'll have more to say, Ray, when we come to what do you want the Obama administration to do. Read page 260 of The Mystery of Capital. Hernando de Soto, funded by USAID, managed to knock out the Shining Path with the power of ideas. This is the most violent Marxist insurgency known in this hemisphere. He managed to defeat it, according to the Peruvian military, by mobilizing the private sector, giving them a stake, bringing the informal sector into the system, and creating a different agenda for the country. And unless that's done through the local ownership that we've been hearing about today, we won't solve the other problems. So, from Doug North to Hernando de Soto, via the mobilization through people like Ajmal Ghani, that's what we got to do. Thank you.
Okay, last. Let's take a deep breath. I'm going to try to address concisely the challenges to coordination and delivering effectively goods and services on the ground in times of crisis, something we don't do very well, and how executive education might be a vehicle, a tool, in order to be able to transform our capabilities to do that. Who are the actors who show up on the ground in times of crisis, whether humanitarian disaster, or whether man-made disasters or natural disasters or conflict? We have the military. The military bring, as you know, enormous planning capabilities, logistical capabilities, everything from engineering and medicine to communications, transportation, and so on. Lots of people and lots of money that they can use flexibly. We have the private sector. John talked a little bit about the private sector. And not just private companies who have supply chain capabilities to get goods and services from far away to an affected area, but also nonprofits, NGOs, some of you who may be represented in this audience, who are experts in needs assessments, project designs, content, and so on. U.S. government agencies, don't want to talk about them. We'll take a long time to do that, but I'm happy to talk about my experiences in Iraq with all of those government agencies. The local governments, I was going to spend some time about how important it is not to ignore local authorities, but President Zellick did a great job in doing that and making sure we don't forget that major goal of providing legitimacy and capacity to those local governments. They are an actor on the ground as well, and they need to be part of the team. International organizations and other bilateral donors, a group of actors. But the final group of actors that appear on the ground in times of crisis that I want to draw to your attention are the media. The media are there. The media have a role. The media do report and analyze. They provide analyses and reporting that is often extremely valuable, not just for affected populations in the world, but for the rest of the actors to know what other people are doing. But sometimes the reporting is misleading. Sometimes it is inaccurate, based on the information that they get, that reporters get, that editors get, and therefore it can be harmful. So I would argue that we really need to pay attention to our media brethren in order to have more effective delivery of goods and services and to leverage that observer effect of the journalist on the ground affecting the thing that she or he is actually observing. What are the impediments to collaboration on the ground among these various organizational cultures? Number one is a weak or even absent bond of trust among them. And that comes from legitimate grievances about the other group, as well as prejudices and misperceptions about what they are doing or might do. There's, of course, that ease of staying within your own comfort zone, preserving your own turf of what you do, and protecting your equities vis-a-vis your stakeholders back home. And that desire for independence and neutrality of operations, especially vis-a-vis the military, many are unwilling to be associated with the military. And especially not to be tainted by them. A number of physical barriers exist that prevent effective collaboration among the actors in times of crisis. That may be a reluctance or an inability to share information. The reluctance comes from the fact that this information is mine. It is proprietary in the terms of the private sector. It is classified in the terms of the public sector. And often we find incompatible information technology systems, so we couldn't share information even if we want to. There are a number of legal and regulatory obstacles that we've been talking about today, the need for new authorities, the mandates of organizational charters and the laws of donor organizations, as well as host nation organizations, host nation governments that sometimes impede that collaboration. Resource shortfalls, both in terms of people and money, logistics, and then there are the conflicting methodologies and assessments, metrics, and even strategies and goals. We have different strategies and goals when we get on the ground. We have found that, in fact, establishing institutions of executive education to be able to bring together the variety of organizational cultures in a non-threatening, open atmosphere can be conducive to breaking down those bonds, the lack of trust, and also establishing a sense that we actually can sit down and solve some problems. The irony about getting educational opportunities today is that because of the scarcity of human and financial resources, most of the agencies and organizations find it difficult to get the right people to attend education, to devote the time to attend education, both in terms to learn, but also to teach others about who you are and what your organization does. There are rare opportunities we have found to bring together all three of these organizational cultures, military, private sector, and civilian government agencies, in that kind of impartial non-threatening environment. But another irony of the situation is if in the Obama administration new resources do flow to especially the civilian government, agencies hire more people. The civilian-military imbalance is redressed. SCRS is, in fact, fully funded. Then education becomes all the more imperative because we will need to educate and cross-train all of these new hires cross-culturally, over time, and outside of their own stovepipe systems. The bottom line, therefore, for the administration is that the United States should rapidly and immediately develop and expand executive education opportunities for 21st century crisis response capabilities, both in terms of response as well as in prevention. The irony of today's world is that the same organizations that find themselves in a crisis-stricken country actually have been working together all along when there wasn't a crisis, but they never bothered to collaborate among themselves. We need to change that. We need to bring in the practitioners from the organizations, those who work at an operational level, that is, who implement strategic decisions from their leaderships and give tools on the ground to ground-level participants who are charged with making tactical decisions based on unique and constantly changing conditions. Those participants in properly constructed educational opportunities have to reevaluate themselves and their own organizational cultures, ask the questions why not, and how, open up in frank and very aggressive debate, but productive discussions, and discussions not only to discover ways to implement crisis remediation, but also collaborative pre-crisis requirements and initiatives. And we find that actually getting together and sitting in someone else's chair, putting on someone else's shoes, goes a long way in order to break down some of those prejudices and that mistrust. And the demonstration effect is very powerful of sitting in a small workshop and arriving at a solution among different organizational cultures. By gosh, we can actually solve this. That law that we thought was in our way, it's not really in our way because there are ways to get around or to find a different way to skin this cat, if you will. The good news, and I will close on this, is that today the military and civilian government agencies do understand the need for such education. The bad news is that funding for such education and training is tremendously lacking. But also private sector participation is lacking. And many private sector organizations, NGOs, as well as corporations, avoid courses that are military related, especially those that are located on military facilities. And most private organizations do not run their own cross-cultural educational programs for times of crisis. My plea to those of you who may be in the private sector today, in this room, is to do what you can to participate in these kinds of practical, pragmatic educational fora with your public sector counterparts and the military, especially the ones that you don't work so well with or that you don't work so often with. And that you should consider running your own programs, whether individually or through some voluntary associations that you may belong to. With that, I will end.
Thank you very much to the panelists for those very thoughtful remarks. And in the remarks, we see a lot of analysis about what is possible, what is feasible, and potential ways of getting there. Now it's time for your questions. We have cards at each chair. Our staff will move around, and you could just hold them up, and they will collect them, and I'll pose as many as I could to the panelists. But while we collect the various questions, I'll use my prerogative as chair to pose the first question to the panelists. We recognize that the need for supporting economic reform is great, and that the players in the international stage are many. Finding ways to collaborate effectively, as President Zelek mentioned during lunch, and most of the panelists have alluded during the discussions, is critically important. However, a number of the emerging players in the development assistance business are non-traditional. Countries like China. By some estimates, the Chinese government will be rivaling the World Bank's IDA assistance by 2012, 2013. They're important players. Does the panel view this as an obstacle or an opportunity? Very brief comments, please. We'll start with
Thank you, Raymond. I think it's an opportunity. I believe that the resources that all of us carry within the foreign assistance framework. As most of you know, within the United States Director of Foreign Assistance, there's a little over $40 billion that we are investing every year on behalf of the American people. It's a lot of money. So the coordination and the cooperation with other governments is important, because as you begin to look around the world, there are so many needs that if you can coordinate with other entities, it's very helpful. In China, we talked to them a bit about public-private partnerships, because in response to their earthquake, they had an extraordinarily effective response. And as a result, they would be very good partners working on natural disasters in other places around the world. And we talked about it in Liberia when Steve was with us, and we were looking at ways that all countries could gather together, whether it was in the education sector or other sectors. So I think there's enormous potential. I think we should see it as an opportunity. It's a time of opportunity, and think of it as something that private businesses and other governments and multilateral institutions, as well as foundations and academic institutions, can all do together.
Thank you. Steve, any comments?
Well, it's happening whether we like it or not, so we better make it an opportunity. But I think it is an opportunity. But the key, I think, with bringing China and Saudi Arabia, some other donors, and even some of the big foundations that are now big actors, is to bring them into the organizations and the dialogues, not to keep them out. Part of this is to bring the Chinese and other groups into donor coordination groups. They're not even listed. If you go to the OECD DAC website, of course, they're not a member of the OECD, but you can't find, they're sort of excluded from donors as if they don't exist. We have to bring them into those organizations, into the Paris Club for debt restructuring kinds of organizations and other things. And I think encourage recipient countries to insist on transparency and openness. To me, that's the key. When I've seen how the Chinese government and other aid organizations work in other countries, if the recipient country wants them to be undercover and quiet and behind the scenes, then they'll do it. They'll be more than happy to oblige. But if, as in the case of Liberia, it's the country insists on openness, transparency, playing according to the rules, they're happy to play along. They're not trying to undercut that. So I think if we can encourage them to be part of the system and play ball, it provides a great opportunity. Lord knows there's not enough resources to do all the things that need to get done in low-income countries, so we ought to welcome the opportunity that's there, but work with them to make as much of it as possible.
Thank you.
Well, I don't have a lot more to add. I think that's obviously true. Word of caution. I don't think the Chinese government has quite the understanding that perhaps we're assuming they do. Perhaps they will by 2012 or 2020, whenever it was that your end date was there, of the idea of transparency and accountability in government procurements. So two things. One, to the extent that state-owned enterprises or quasi-state-owned enterprises in China are a vehicle, better corporate governance of those enterprises and demanding that the actual transactions are clear and transparent is going to be key. And then second, and this goes with a lot of different things, despite the fact that oil prices have declined right now, I would expect sovereign wealth funds to continue to increase. I'm not particularly worried about the Chinese or Dubai Port World operating in the OECD countries, but I would be very concerned about them working in what are still non-market economies of Africa and others. And so again, trying to get good solid rules like the OECD framework or the recent statements that have come out from the IMF and having them apply to these sovereign wealth funds, I think is going to be absolutely vital.
Thanks.
I yield my time.
Okay. Well, the first round of questions will be specific to each panelist. The first question will be to you, Steve. And it reads, as an advisor to President Johnson Sirleaf, you mentioned the Peace Corps returning to Liberia. And the question is, how about the Peace Corps in Kosovo? And I think I'd like to broaden that to ask you to give your thoughts, based on your experience and your work on managing the foreign your work on modernizing the U.S. foreign assistance. Is there a role for organizations like the Peace Corps, and how could they be most effective? The next question will be for you, John. It's on public-private partnerships, and it says, is there an interest in green investment by the private sector, alternative energy on a small scale? The questioner wants to know whether or not this is something that's viable, particularly in the fragile states, in the context of fragile states. Then for you, David, a question on corruption. It says, how important is combating illicit economies in the post-conflict, and what elements, what would be elements of a successful strategy? And do you know of any success stories, given your interagency experience, if you could highlight any of those? For you, Administrator Ford, it says, Dr. Zellick mentioned during his luncheon speech that the U.S. generally does not participate in trust funds. Are trust funds seen as a means to improve collaboration and coordination at a donor level? And what are your thoughts within the context of providing foreign aid to post-conflict and fragile economies? We'll start at the end of the table with you, Steve.
Thanks. I'm a little biased. I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and my wife was the first third-generation Peace Corps volunteer, and my aunt was Peace Corps country director in Thailand. So I think, other than that, I'm very unbiased when it comes to Peace Corps. No, I was very thrilled that Peace Corps went back into Liberia. I do think there is, I'm no expert on Kosovo, so I certainly can't comment on the particular appropriateness, but I do think in post-conflict situation, of course you have to be careful, but there is scope to come in once there's some security, particularly into urban areas and teaching kinds of environments, into more structured kinds of things. I don't think in Liberia or in other places quite ready to send somebody out to, out into the middle of nowhere to be a rural development volunteer on their own, but to be in a more urban structured setting, I think is great. President-elect Obama has pushed hard in his campaign for expanded ways for volunteerism and mentioned specifically Peace Corps, and I think that's terrific. I think we need to also look beyond and think of other ways to tap into the energy and the spirit of people with other kinds of skills for programs that might be similar to Peace Corps but a little bit different. And in particular, I have in mind a program that we run in Liberia called the Liberia Fellows Program, which is geared mostly for young professionals that are 29, 30 years old with a graduate degree and a couple years of experience. A little bit too senior and with a graduate degree, perhaps not for Peace Corps. They're focused on policy issues and on government service. And we have 15 fellows working in Liberia right now as special assistants to ministers in the Liberian government. Because one of the problems with the capacity is the capacity shortages, is just getting stuff done. There's no shortage of good ideas. They don't necessarily need technical assistance to come up with 10 new good ideas. They got lots of good ideas. They don't have the staff to implement them. So these fellows work as special assistants to do everything from photocopying to drafting speeches to writing policy papers for the Liberian government. Half of them are Liberian expatriates, half of them are Americans, and they go off for a fraction of what it costs for regular technical assistance and are having a great time, spend a year in Liberia. That's the kind of thing that I think we can expand to take advantage of other people with other professional skills who would love to have some experience in engaging in developing countries and to provide a role for it. So I think there's an opportunity to expand in that way.
Thank you.
Well, I can't do complete justice to this question because it's such a broad one, but the key to making these kind of public-private partnerships for green investment work anywhere is got to be to align incentives, focus on the price mechanism, and take a look at what are the drivers of the private sector side of a public-private partnership, and it's profit. What is the public side? Reducing their costs, obviously, and harnessing new technologies. So I think there is obviously a lot of interest in the private sector in terms of investment. And remember, the private sector is not a monolith. It's a whole lot of different things. To give you just two examples, I was in Medellin, Colombia, which is sort of a post-conflict environment, and there was a really cool display there at a conference I was at of the private sector of Latin America, featuring things like solar-powered light poles, where you could stick up a light pole in a place where you're not going to run an electricity line. It would be powered up for the day, and then you'd have enough power to have, some light at the end of the evening. Now, somebody thought of that, and they were selling them. So there's a good example of how you could do it. Now, to do that on a large scale, to scale it up, you need to align the incentives, and you need to create frameworks that encourage that kind of investment. On the larger scale side, companies like Walmart and others are in Intel. I just bought a personal computer this weekend and was given quite a lengthy lecture by the Sony salesperson about how all the green elements of their computer. But part of it is, of course, salesmanship, but another large part of it is recycling, reducing the cost structures, and we're seeing this again through the price mechanism, through energy prices, which have reversed for a while, but I think it's temporary. So you do have a powerful incentive now to do things like reduce the amount of packaging, reduce transport costs, things that were not part of that price structure before have changed. And read Thomas Friedman's column about what we need to do to keep that price mechanism working. He goes, it's every third day, so you can't miss it.
Corruption occurs where there is money and power. I don't need to preach to you about the destructive effects of corruption. It is a drain on resources, especially in developing countries. It undermines legitimacy of authorities, and it promotes economic and political stuntedness in a nation. There are a variety of things that the international community recognizes as being among the solutions to corruption, breaking the back of corruption in societies. Number one is leadership, and not just at the national level, but at leadership at all levels, village, family. Number two is participation in the society, an increase in participation, especially in both men and women in the social, political, and economic life of a society. Accountability and transparency in transactions and in public life, which goes along, therefore, with the development of proper institutions and the ability to bring people to account. This is not easily solved in any country. I don't know of any experience off the top of my head in any country that I have served in where corruption was brought under control. But I think we have seen a number of countries where it has gotten a whole lot worse, and that's quite dramatic for what we do. Georgia, Atlanta?
Georgia.
That's
Georgia
Georgia.
has done very well.
All right, my question, in case you've forgotten it, was about the trust funds and the World Bank. And there, I think, are a number of reasons the United States does not exclusively use trust funds. We do in some places, such as in Afghanistan. And we do that because it is a good multi-donor facility that is working on both infrastructure and capacity building. And so from country to country, we make individual decisions about using World Bank trust funds. One of the reasons we do not do this in every country is because we have such strong links with our non-governmental organizations and our other implementers in the field. The United States has enormous power in these many implementers who are our partners around the world. And the trust funds would mean that we would have a different approach. But we feel that our implementing partners have been very helpful and useful. They are close to the people most in need. They are the eyes and the ears in almost every country. The other part of it is that it allows for innovation. Small and medium-sized organizations can work to great benefit. John Sullivan has been chairing a group called the Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Assistance, and one of their many recommendations to us is to make sure that we don't just have a few big baskets of contracts, but that we open it up to many, many players. And so that's another reason why we take the approach we do, which is to sometimes use trust funds, but not always. I think there's something else to think about also as we consider trust funds, and it's something that Congress often brings up, and that is related to something that David mentioned, which is the press and who gets the credit for the fact that this assistance is moving. And when it goes through these multilateral facilities, often the American people are not credited. There are very few people around the world that realize that it is the American people that are sending help. And most people don't know that we are half of the world's food aid. And so sometimes, you know, you have to stand up and say, this is from the American people. And so bilateral institutions help with that. And lastly, we've been working very hard on foreign assistance reform in the last few years. I see Steve Krasner in the front row, who's been very much part of that, and Steve Radlett over here on our panel. And as we look at areas for real progress, gathering all the U.S. government, organizations, and entities and funding would be enormously powerful for the United States, and I think that would be a good place to start.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm getting frantic signals from the back of the room. But before we leave, I promise to give each panelist 30-second opportunity to make one recommendation to the incoming administration. Let's start with Steve and just move down the panel very quickly, and then you'll join me in thanking them for a job well done.
Thank you. My one recommendation would be to take advantage of the opportunity where the political support and the more broad public support is there to not necessarily spend a lot more money right now. That's going to be tough, but to take the opportunity to really modernize and update our foreign assistance organization and system so that we can meet 21st century challenges that are in the interest of the United States, but also in the interest of poor countries around the world.
Thank you.
Well, the advisory committee that Henrietta referred to actually has come out with a full range of recommendations, all of which are posted on USAID's website. And one of the key recommendations is to fully implement USAID's new economic growth strategy, which does the job of linking economic growth and democratic development. So well done, Henrietta, and I hope the new administration builds on that and really implements the hell out of it.
My organization has prepared a white paper that will hang on the website of USIP after this on the role of executive education, and my plea to the administration would be, as we propose funding for hiring new personnel, to make sure that those funding requests include money for education and training.
Thanks.
Development is done by people, for people, and institutions and nations. So increase funding for the people who do development in the organizations. Keep the Development Leadership Initiative, the income of new Foreign Service officers coming into USAID so they can represent our country proudly around the world for years to come.
This is a discussion we'll keep alive at USIP. Thank you very much for being part of this. Join me in thanking the panel.